Conasí, how are ye? Welcome to the Candlelit Tales YouTube channel, where we are not telling a story today, we're talking. And today I want to talk about an upcoming fire festival, the next spoke of the wheel of the year, Lughnasa, the beginning of autumn. So I think a lot of us think of autumn as a summer month, partly because in Ireland we're still off school and partly because the weather is still warm. But traditionally, August was the start of autumn. It was the start of the harvest season. And that's what Lughnasa celebrated. The end of a long summer and the beginning of the dark half of the year. Because if you think about where our ancestors were at this time of year, especially in the kind of agricultural period in Ireland, this was the time of year when their supplies would be running low, if not running out. And a lot of the seanchals around July and the summer hint at that. Úl na is one that just means July of the cabbages, because July was the month where poor people would only have cabbages to eat because they were waiting for the potato harvest to come in. Before we had potatoes, we had wheat, and it was the same deal. You have this hungry gap at the end of the summer before the harvest comes in. And it was the time when people would be surviving on mostly onions, garlic, salad leaves, the things that were able to be harvested, and also very, very heavily reliant on milk. Because going back, way back, one of the reasons that Ireland is so into cattle, and one of the reasons our mythology is so focused around cattle, is that it was dairy that kept people alive during the summer. It was dairy that people ate. Most of these dairy herds that were the signal for wealth, they weren't being farmed for meat, they were being farmed for milk and for cheese. And that's what people ate. That was their reliable protein source. Obviously, if you were on the coast, you could eat oysters, which were considered a poor man's food in Ireland for a long time, or you could eat fish. But for most people in the Midlands, it was cattle, it was dairy that they relied on, while waiting with bated breath for the crops to come in and the first harvest to begin. So this was a fire festival that celebrated that moment. So these fire festivals throughout the year, they start with Samhain, and then you have Imbolg, Bealtaine, and now Lughnasa. It's sort of the last one before the Celtic New Year at Samhain, which we will talk about another time. Lughnasa is the only one of those four that we have the name of a deity attached to, and that deity is Lugh, Lugh Love. Lugh is a character in Irish mythology. He's one of the Tuatha Dé Danann. He's actually half Tuatha Dé Danann, half Fomorian. His mother Eithlinne was a Fomorian princess. His father Cian was a Tuatha Dé Danann cowherd. See, we're back to cows already. And Lugh was a great hero. And he was a great king, and he was a great warrior. And not only that, he was, in fact, the Samildánach, the master of all skills. There's a story about him coming to Tara and introducing himself. And Tara was making ready for war at that time, so they stopped him at the gate and said he couldn't come in unless he had a skill to share. And he started listing off the skills he had to share. And every one he mentioned, they said, oh, we already have one of those. We already have someone to make the spears. We already have someone to pour the wine. We already have someone to read the stars. And eventually, Lugh said, well, go and ask if there's anyone who can do everything that I've just mentioned. And of course there wasn't, because people specialised in those days. But not Lugh. Lugh was a generalist. Lugh was a Renaissance deity of ancient Ireland, long before the Renaissance. And he was able to do all of these things, so they let him in. There's a whole story about Lugh that I realised I'm starting to slip into. But you can find it. We have podcasts about it. We'll put them down in the show notes to link to those episodes if you want to find out more about Lugh and the Battle of MYTHOLOGY and Balor of the Evil Eye and all of that stuff. And it was Lugh who set up the most famous festival at Lughnasa, which was not called Lughnasa, it was called the Talon Games. They happened at Lughnasa, and they happened at a place called TAILTÚ, or Taltown, in its anglicised form, which is obviously a place that you can go to today. There's a house, there's a hill, it's very lovely. Lugh set up the games, or the Éanach, which really means a kind of a fair, in honour of his foster mother TAILTÚ. TAILTÚ was a firbolg queen, and she cleared the plains to make room for agriculture, which kind of sounds terrible today because Ireland is a terribly deforested country. But back in those days when people were first settling, they found an island that was densely forested. And as previously mentioned, these were people who primarily raised dairy cows. So the clearing of plains was actually really important for a long time, until by various reasons and by various means, we went too far and cleared too much. And now we are trying to reforest, but that's another story. I'm tangenting, I feel. Anyway, there's also a story about TAILTÚ on the podcast, and we'll put it down in the description below. Lugh set up the Talon Games in honour of his foster mother. So the Talon Games are kind of thought of as being like the Olympics. And they were a little bit like the Olympics in that it was tests of skill and strength from people all over Ireland. But there was also very much a kind of a country fair, bake-off vibe to it. There were also crafting competitions, and there were competitions among armourers, as well as sort of feats of athleticism and skill and strength. But it didn't kick off with the games. It kicked off with a remembrance for the dead. So it was kind of 3 phases to it. The first one was the religious bit, where the Druids would lead everyone in remembering all those who had passed in the year before, keening, lamenting, celebrating, and lighting great big fires as a remembrance rite. Then you had the Brehons come up, and they used the Tailtúin Fair because it was a gathering of all of these people from all over Ireland. They would announce and proclaim any changes that had been made to the laws. The Brehon law, for a very long time, was an oral tradition, like our storytelling tradition. And so the Brehons would use this opportunity to tell people of the ways that they had conferred and updated and changed the law, much as we do today, except it was word of mouth rather than law libraries. And then you got onto the games and the sports and the crafting and the competitions and all of that exuberance of end of summer energy. And it was all really to celebrate the fact that the dangerous time of year was coming to an end. By this time, you'd have your first fruits. You'd be able to gather the beginnings of the next harvest. And you'd probably have some idea of what kind of year you were going to have ahead as well. Now, another thing that happened at the Talon Games that's probably worth mentioning is it was also a bit of a lonely hearts thing. If you wanted to get married and you didn't have anyone that you had in mind to marry, you could go along, put yourself forward for a Talon Marriage. That was a tradition. Let me start that sentence again. That was a slightly strange tradition. Prospective partners met completely blind. It was like a mass blind date. The only way of telling who you would get was through a hole in a stone wall. The women would put their hands through and the men would decide based on a hand that they saw who they wanted to take a punt on. I assume you'd be looking for like calluses, hard workers. But maybe that's me. Maybe that's my criteria for a wife. Anyway, this mass marriage ceremony would be held at the top of the hill at Taltown. And you might think, well, this is madness. You're marrying somebody completely sight unseen. You have no idea who they are. How did this ever become a tradition? But of course, the important bit was it was only valid for 1 year, which was quite common with marriages in ancient Ireland. We have the tradition that is known as hand fasting, which was a marriage, but it was a marriage that you could opt out of after the first year. And so if you didn't opt out of it after the first year, you were married for life. Well, no, you weren't actually. If you didn't opt out of it after the first year, you were married. And if you wanted to split up, you'd have to go through a divorce procedure because, yes, there was divorce in ancient Ireland. For a Tailtown marriage, there was a particular ritual, though. You'd have to come back to Taltú, to the hill, the following year at Lughnasa, and the two of you would go up to the top of the hill, turn your backs on each other and walk away from each other. And that was the dissolution of the Talon Marriage. And because people kept their own property going into marriage, those kinds of separations were easier to manage, and any children that were conceived in the first year of marriage were not considered illegitimate, but the couple didn't have to stay together if they didn't want to. Now, I found out a lot of the stuff that I'm telling you at the moment from mythology, but also from a book that I read by Máire MacNeill. She wrote a book called The Festival at Lughnasa, and it's all about survivals of this Lughnasa festival into the modern era. And it's kind of fascinating. If you're interested in this sort of thing, I'd really, really recommend it. It's out of print. I was able to get it at the library. Libraries are great. You should probably get one at the library. It's a really interesting book because she charts all of these different celebrations all over the country that were happening in and around the end of July, the beginning of August. And her argument is that basically all of these are Lughnasa survivals. They're all related to Lughnasa, but the date has moved a bit because Lughnasa, unlike Samhain and unlike Imbolc, which are kind of household festivals, like you stay in your neighbourhood, you stay close to home. Lughnasa traditions were about the whole community, the wider community, all getting together and gathering. So there's sort of a 2-week spread from late July into early August when these different festivals would take place. A lot of them were at hilltops, a lot of them were at wells, a lot of them were at local churches or rivers. It very much depends on where you are in the country, what people got up to for Lughnasa. But generally speaking, they were big gatherings between different parishes where everyone would get together, have this kind of fair, and there was often sports, and things often got a little bit rowdy. So they were usually quite looked down on by the Catholic Church and eventually disapproved of into inexistence. She has some great stories in that book about faction fighting, which if you think of the old sort of punch caricatures of Irish people with the shillelagh clubs, there was a kind of martial arts called faction fighting in Ireland. I don't really know how to describe this because I don't know what it was like, but apparently you would get together in teams and beat the shite out of each other with shillelaghs. And that was kind of looked on as a bit of fun and a sport, but you were also whacking each other with big sticks. So sometimes people got really badly injured, and sometimes people had broken bones, broken heads. There were sometimes fatalities, although that doesn't seem to have been the intention or the point of it. So this was part of the reason that these things started to get cracked down on and pushed to the side. But for a long, long time, they were considered to be Christian, or rather Catholic festivals, and were linked very strongly to stories of St. Patrick. So some of those pilgrimages would be to Patrick's wells, or churches that were said to have been founded by Patrick, or hills. Croagh Patrick is kind of the most famous one in Ireland that's named after Patrick. But there are a lot of hilltops associated with St. Patrick, again, because they were previously sites of worship, probably for pagans anyway, and these things get passed down and changed and new overlays put on top of them. And the names of these festivals also shifted away from Lughnasa. So some of them were called Garlic Sunday or Garland Sunday, and a lot of them were called Crom Doves Sunday in a lot of parts of the country. Crom Dove is a story that we've also tried to do on the podcast before, and we'll put down in the show notes. But also stories of Crom Dove are very difficult to pin down because there are a lot of them on the one hand, but on the other hand, a lot of them have very, very slight variations. And then there's kind of half a dozen different ones, very different ones. To give you an example, in one of the stories, Crom Dove is St. Patrick's servant, and he's gathering sticks, he's gathering firewood, and he comes in interrupting Patrick giving a mass to ask him a question about when will the Slua She go to heaven or hell, presumably. And Patrick stops the mass to turn around and say to him, well, they won't go anywhere until Judgment Day because they're bound to this mortal earth and they cannot go to heaven or to hell because they can't die. Which is, just a sort of a little theological folding in of our sort of Slua She Tuatha Dé Danann fairy folk beliefs. But in most of the stories of Crom Dove, he's the last pagan chieftain of Ireland. He's the last holdout. And there's this story that takes place in a lot of different parts of the country where Patrick has a confrontation with the last pagan chieftain. And I know I'm saying this in a confusing way, but that's because it's confusing. Because in some parts of the country, the last pagan chieftain is Crom Dove, and in other parts of the country, he isn't. He's got a different name for a different local chieftain. However it happens, in that story, Patrick sends a servant to the last local pagan to ask for provisions for his church. And the chieftain, Crom Dove, or whoever he is, says something along the lines of, he can have that particular bull if he can catch him, deliberately pointing to his most ferocious, most untamable bull. The servant goes back to Patrick saying, I can't, this bull is monstrous and terrifying and is going to kill me if I try and capture him. Patrick gives the servant a harness, which magically tames the bull. So he's able to bring the bull back. They're able to slaughter the bull and have a great feast in the church. And then inevitably, Crom Dove, or whatever local variant of Crom Dove, turns up and demands his bull back and says, well, I wasn't serious. I obviously wasn't giving you the bull. To which St. Patrick rearranges all of the bull's bones as they would have been and prays, and the bull sort of reconstitutes itself into its former size, but also its former temperament, upon which the chieftain converts to Christianity. That's a story that exists in so many different variations around the countryside that it's kind of mind-boggling. And the bull doesn't always come back to life, but there's usually a bull. There's some kind of a bull. There's some kind of a bull feast. The other thing that's interesting about Crom Dove is that he's probably related to Crom Cruach, that first name being the same. And they're both refer to somebody with a crooked back. Dove means black. So it's black Crom, or I can't remember what Cruach means. Anyway,
Crom Cruach is associated as being a harvest god. Very little survives about the worship of Crom Cruach, and very little of it is reliable, but he does seem to have had a strong association with the harvest and also with sacrifice and maybe human sacrifice. But maybe that's propaganda. I don't know. Either way, it's interesting that Crom Dubh Sunday, named after the chieftain rather than after Patrick, and associated with Crom Cruach, is one of the latest names that was given to this festival. And that was confusing. And I don't apologize, because it's more confusing if you read it yourself, but also you should read it yourself because that book is a very, very good book. So today, where does that leave us? Well, Lughnasa is still the name of the month of August in the Irish language, and there are some celebrations for Lughnasa. I think less so than Samhain and Bealtaine, which have had real revivals in recent times. Lughnasa is one of those that's a little bit out on its own. There are some festivals and music festivals that use the name, but it's a sort of end of summertime. It might be time to give these things another go. There have been some attempts to revive the Talon Games, which went on up until the 13th century, but none of them have really caught on. The Gaelic Athletic Association tried to revive them at one point. I think maybe we need to bring in the craft fair element. I feel like they were maybe missing that. Have a story slam and a storytelling competition or something. I don't know. Maybe it's time for another go. And I would be very curious to hear from you. Do you celebrate Lughnasa? Have you heard of Lughnasa before? Do you have a celebration for the first fruits of the harvest in your part of the world? Or have you ever heard of any of these things? Or would you like to try and bring it back? Let us know.